Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi ashabihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So today I'll be talking about, is God really there, right? Actually, I died down the topic a little bit because actually a more controversial title I had in mind, right? But we can leave that for next time, inshallah. And then so basically why I choose this topic is because I remember talking to a brother and we were having this discussion, and I remember reading it everywhere online. 2020, to say that it hasn't been gone off with a good start is an understatement. Meaning that with all the things that's happening around us, right, all those calamities, remember, like in the beginning of 2020, Jakarta was basically welcomed with a flood warning, right, with typhoon warning that would over siege an entire city, right? And followed by that incident, a few days later, we have the volcanic eruption in Manila, right? And even moving on further, say for example, the Australian bushfire that's still ongoing, and also the UK flood, and also the Uyghur Muslims who are still persecuted, right? And for out of all of those incidents, that one incident that's most relevant to us could be the outbreak of the coronavirus, right? And all these calamities seems to fall all in 2020, right? And sometimes this may lead us to question, right? To question whether it's a punishment or not. Whether could all these be a punishment or not. And whether it's a punishment actually depends very much on your response, right? Can be a punishment, can be a punishment. I've heard brothers who've claimed whatever is happening in the world or whatever has happened in China recently is because of what they've done to the Muslims there, right? But then all these actually can be a punishment or can be not a punishment, right? Depending on your response. Because subhanAllah, Allah would actually send us wake-up calls. And this wake-up calls can be in different forms. It could be a form of a sin, because sometimes when we recognize that how bad we've been as a human beings, sometimes bring us back to Allah closer ever before, right? Or it could be in the form of calamities, right? Ibn Qayyim rahimullah actually mentioned that these wake-up calls could be in the form of hardship, could be a storm that people go through, could be a loss of health, could be a loss of relatives, loss of loved ones, right? All these are actually a test or a wake-up call. And all those wake-up calls comes with one purpose alone, to make us realize who we are and what should we be doing, right? And then so that's why these wake-up calls are supposed to be implemented, or how should I put it, should be internalized, right? Because if this is not internalized, Hasan al-Basri rahimahullah actually mentioned, if those wake-up calls are not capitalized, it will actually bring you further away from Allah. Because your heart will be so accustomed to this hypocrisy where you no longer find or respond to those wake-up calls, right? And this is actually from Surah Al-Hadid, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked us, has the time not come for those who believe in Allah to be softened, to be softened from the reminder that Allah gives us, right? And so all these discussion today is actually to bring you to realize that the main reason why people are refuting God's existence is more than just an intellectual debate. It's more than just an intellectual argument. And later I'll be quoting some of the non-Muslims who not necessarily believe in fate, who actually thinks the same too, right? And then so that's why this discussion today, all those calamities that's going on in the world, leads us with two choices, right? One, listen or internalize to this wake-up call, respond to this wake-up call, and turn back to Allah. Or the other side of the coin, which is to refute God's existence or to deny Allah's existence, right? And so these two choices, depending on whoever make this choice, would have an outcome that would determine whether it's a punishment or it's a blessing in disguise. Right? As much as science is generally seen as the custodian of wisdom, custodian of knowledge, right? Any arguments that's against it is usually seen as inferior. Especially with youths these days, the worldview that youths are dealing with usually makes us question whether what we are believing is correct or not, right? And today I will be discussing from a more intellectual perspective that why science could in fact be the strongest argument for God's existence, right? And so disclaimer, it will be a little scientific. There might be scientific terms coined during the talk, but I'll try to use layman terms to explain those concepts, right? Inshallah. And so before I start talking about it, to approach it from a scientific perspective, right? I want to give you a disclaimer or a synopsis where actually science cannot explain the existence of God. Science cannot explain the existence of God, nor can it explain our existence, by the way. Science cannot explain the existence of God, but it cannot explain our existence too, right? And this is a very important point where would actually help you better understand the coming topic, right? And so before I talk about why science, though, could be a possible argument to support God's existence, I need to start off with describing the nature of science, right? And especially when science today is seen as the most important asset any countries or nations could invest in, right? Because it can literally change an entire world with basically what we know of science today, right? But then there are limitations to it. And some of these limitations would be that science is limited to empirical observations. Science is limited to empirical observations, meaning, there's a big term here, empirical means it's limited to only observations that our senses can perceive. So say, for example, science can explain gravity, because gravity is something that we can experience, and so science can basically not only explain whether there is gravity, but it can also explain how gravity works, right? And then so this is actually becomes the limitation of science. Because why? Then that would mean any observations, those are not limited to our senses. Science cannot prove its existence, nor disprove its existence, right? And then so despite the worldview that's going on, which is what science bring about, is called materialism, where everything or anything that our senses can perceive is something that science would try to quantize. Is there another battery? I think it's out of battery. Another mic. Is it out of battery? Okay. And so we were talking about how science has bring about a worldview called materialism, right? So anything or everything that can be materialistically quantified is basically what science can try to explain. But anything outside of it is where science cannot explain, right? And say, for example, science cannot explain love because there is an experience or an outcome because of the existence or the lack of existence of love. But then science cannot explain or quantify what love is, right? And so this is the limitation, one of the limitation of science, right? And other than that, the other limitation of science is basically science cannot explain the why behind every phenomena. Say, for example, science can explain what gravity is, or even how it works, or in what circumstances it can work. But science cannot explain why gravity works. So meaning, for every physical phenomena out there, science cannot explain the purpose behind any of those phenomena. Right? You get me? Like, so basically science cannot explain the purpose behind every existence or occurrence of any phenomena. So there is this limitation of science. Though, with all these limitations, this is not to disregard the importance of it, but it's to recognize its limitation. And say, for example, just now I mentioned about science is limited to our senses, right? Or quantifying or explaining our senses. And we know science itself told us that there's a beginning to the universe. There's a beginning to the universe. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of the concept of Big Bang, where it has been considered some of the most empirically or math-wise correct model to explain the beginning of the universe, basically, right? And so if Big Bang is the beginning of universe, and that would mean space and time was non-existence before that. Space and time are non-existence before the Big Bang occurred. Then how can science itself explain the nothing that is before space and time? You get me? Like, so if there's a beginning to universe, science tells us there's a beginning to universe, but yet space and time comes after it, and anything before that, there's no space and no time in it for science to quantify it. So that means, hello, testing. Okay. So that means if science itself says there's a beginning in space and time, then the cause of it should be both timeless and spaceless, meaning it's not immaterial in itself. So another example, say for example, the painter analogy, right? If you can never find or you can never expect a painter to be in a drawing, why would we expect God to be within creation? Painter analogy, like say for example, if a painter paints or a chemist who would do experiments would not be in the experiment itself, then why would we expect God to be within creation itself? Or the creator to be within the creation itself? So that would mean that this cause of the universe should be outside of the universe, which is where science cannot explain. But yet there's a disclaimer. I want to see science as nothing more than a perspective and prevalent, especially in this 21st century or even in the times to come, to explain how, just like people in the ancient times would explain God's existence. I'll give an example. There's a Chinese Muslim scholar, right, in the early 17th centuries. He wrote a very beautiful poem. Very beautiful poem, right? And I'll try my best to translate it because it's really, really complicated Chinese. And so what it says is basically, 工藝必有匠，大造必有主. It's a very simple statement, right? And this is the title of his writing, basically. And what it says here is basically, for every masterpiece, for every artwork, there's a designer behind it, right? Then how about the bigger creation? There must be a creator behind it, right? So people in the ancient times, they have this simple mindset, and where they don't need all those complicated arguments for complicated as in scientific arguments to support their claim, but yet their beliefs in a creator hold strongly because they see the effect of the existence of a creator, meaning the creation, right? And then he further writes, 世間一起一物，大義宮殿，千二盤萬，莫不須像作而成. Meaning, he said, for every utensils or for every being, there must, like up till the palaces in classical ancient kingdoms, right? And down to the plates, Chinese artwork, sometimes they have this artistic design of plates, right? Plates or different utensils where they're so carefully carved out or so carefully painted, where today would worth millions or even up to billions of dollars, right, for those classical artworks. And so he mentioned about all those design, right? It's unexpected to be seeing them without a creator or without a designer, right? And so he mentioned further on that the wood, can they become a house on its own, or soil? Can it become utensils or pots on its own? Then how about the sky, which is that it uses gomeng, means it's so wide and so tall, right? How about the ground, which is so broad and so flat, right? And how about the skies with sun, stars, and moon? Those are in equator or in orbits. And how about the mountain and all those animals, which are all in place? Then how can all those be explained without a creator when we cannot even justify the claim that those pots are designer on its own, right? And so he continues with quite a number of illustrations or examples for people to reflect upon, right? And he's a Muslim scholar who was in the early 70s, where science hasn't really reached China, right? But yet he still has this amazing yaqeen or certainty in God's existence or in a creator's existence because of the creation, right? And moving on further, I'm not sure, have you heard of the very famous Arab Bedouin? Like, it's actually recorded in classical Arabic scripture, where when they see the droppings of a camel in a desert, that in itself would mean there must have been a camel passing by. Or when they see a footsteps of animal, they can already, based on the footsteps they see, or predict or assume or even affirm that there must be animals that those pass by it, right? And so the Arab Bedouin is basically saying that just by seeing a cause or an evidence of a creator, of an animal dropping, in itself shows an animal must have passed by. Then how about the creation that we are seeing around us every day? Wouldn't that signify or symbolize there's a greater creator behind? Right? And all those observations, down to China, down to Arabs, like all those observations don't need science to support, right? But yet, based on just simple observation, they have arrived to this conclusion, right? And so with this day and age, I want to see science not necessarily a tool to argue against God, but I want to see, just as the people in the past would use those simple observations to affirm God's existence, I see science not more than a tool, just as they have their tools, which are their eyes, which are their aql, to arrive at this conclusion. Right? And so science is in itself, I believe, or I personally affirms to this, it's in itself the greatest evidence of God's existence. Right? And so in 1966, Time magazine ran a cover, and this cover is basically the title I wanted to name my talk after, right? But then it's too controversial, so I decided to go with a smaller, a died down version of it, right? And so Time magazine ran a cover in 1966 asking, is God dead? Right? And in that same year, Carl Sagan, a very famous astronomer, announced that there are two criteria for life to exist on planets. Two criteria. The right star and the right distance from a star. And pause for a minute. Why does Time magazine ran a cover on this topic? Because that's exactly when science starts to bloom. When science starts to explain or start to explain more of the things that's happening around us, people start to take science as something that would run God obsolete, or that would run God like unnecessary. Because as science can explain things, that in itself would show or may mean that we don't no longer need those so-called revelations to justify our existence, right? But so that's why Time magazine asked this, or ran a cover on this topic, right? And let's continue on with Carl Sagan's two criteria, right? Right kind of star and the right distance from it, right? And so from the very beginning, we have radio telescope from the very beginning. In that same year, there were octillion planets, which is 10 followed by 24 zeros of planets out there. And there are septillion, which is 10 with 21 other zeros behind it, of planets that fulfill these two criteria, right? These two criteria. And so there's this mission called SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, conducted by international organizations to start looking for existence of life outside of Earth, right? But yet, the silence in the universe is deafening. Till this very age, not only were they not able to locate any planets that can support life, I remember 2 years ago, they finally managed to find possible water molecules in planets, which is one of the many criteria, by the way, for existence of life in any planets, right? And the boiling point, the water there in that planet is estimated to be over 1,300 kelvins, right? And so that temperature in itself is not supportive of any life. Right? And so this is just one of the criteria or one of the parameters that would make life possible in any planets. And so those two criteria started to grow as we advance in science. Right? 2 become 10, become 20, and become 50. Until today, to date, we have over 200 parameters. Those are necessary for any planets for any life to exist on planets, right? And a simple example is, for example, Jupiter, right? Every one of us have heard of the planet called Jupiter, right? It may seem very unrelated to our existence, right? But in fact, if it were not Jupiter to be in orbit around Earth like that, we would be a body that would receive multiple meteorites that would crash head on to Earth that wouldn't have permitted life to form. So even Jupiter, a planet that's around it, has has supported our existence. Because Jupiter is really huge in size. And so it managed to attract or even divert many of the meteorites or comets that are hitting Earth. Right? So even for Jupiter, its existence is also very important for life on Earth. And so could all these parameters be perfectly met by accident? Is your next question, right? And so this concept of fine-tuning of the universe have led many scientists to question their stance, right? And so basically, for example, we talked about just now, the universe had a beginning, right? Scientists has basically have inclined towards this direction, right? Basically the concept of Big Bang, right? And there are actually 4 main forces in the entire universe that govern the rules or regulations or occurrence in our entire universe. What are those 4 forces? I will start off with something that's more commonly known, which is the gravitational force. Right? It's one of the 4 main forces, right? Gravitational force we've experienced daily, right? On Earth, with gravity, that's why apple fall on Newton's head, right? And that's how gravity was discovered. And the slightly less obvious or experienced forces are basically called electromagnetic forces, which in other words are light. Lights are considered a force, right? It's a wave, it's a form of wave, it's considered a force. And there's another called weak and strong nuclear force. So all these 4 forces make up the entire existence of the universe, right? And so scientists calculated that and all these forces are governed by constants, which are determined or fixed from the very beginning or slightly after the Big Bang have occurred, right? And if any of those forces were to be altered ever so lightly, then let alone planets would exist. The universe in itself wouldn't exist, right? And so Christopher Hitchens, one of the most strongest or aggressive atheist proponents, right? He's conceded that without question, he's a very, I don't recommend you to listen to him because he's very aggressive in terms of putting forth his stance of atheism. But then he himself admits that, I will quote, without question, that fine-tuning argument was the most powerful argument of the other side. He's an atheist who would argue, who would debate with Christians, with Muslims, or with people of faith against their religious stance, right? And Oxford University professor Dr. John Lennox, who's a mathematician, he mentioned the more we get to know about our universe, the more the hypothesis that there is a creator gains is credibility as the best explanation of why we are here, right? And so all these are actually supporting that no matter how we advance in science, the more we advance in science, the less we are able to explain our existence. Because science, one of the main criteria, or one of the main perspective that science uses is basically called probability, right? Something has to occur when there's a probability of it. Right? And when there is no probability of it, science would basically cast it as impossible. Right? I will be expounding on this concept further on later. And so another professor called Fred Hoyle, he died in the year of 2001, and he made a very famous claim, because he himself does not have any religious background, or nor does he attach himself to any religious faith. But then he made a very big claim that shook the science world. Right? He had this very famous analogy called metal junkyard. Metal junkyard. Which he mentioned that if you were to enter a metal junkyard and were you to subject all those metal pieces in a tornado for however long it is, for whatever material you have that's in abundance of it, you won't get a 747 jumbo jet. I'll repeat. So when you enter a metal junkyard with all the necessary ingredients for a jumbo jet to be built, when you subject all those in a tornado, for however long you subject those metal pieces, you won't get a 747 jumbo jet. Get it? So basically he mentioned about no matter how much you subject any material that's in randomness, never comes with it order. Right? And so this actually resemble one of the story I've heard by Abu Hanifa, rahimullah. Right? He was once approached by a philosopher who wanted to debate him. Right? And Abu Hanifa, and knowing he's a philosopher who affirms that there is no need of God's existence for our existence, right? And so they decided to launch a public debate, right? And so that philosopher invited Imam Ahmed, invited Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, right, to go at a certain time to a place, to a public platform, for that public debate to occur. Right? And then Abu Hanifa agreed. Right? And so the next day came, or the time came for the debate to occur, and that person arrived on time. And he's waiting for Abu Hanifa to arrive. Right? And moments passed by, hours passed by, but yet Abu Hanifa didn't appear yet. Right? And so after hours of wait, Abu Hanifa finally arrived. Right? And that philosopher got outraged. And then he argued with Abu Hanifa, I thought we've agreed to come at this time. Were you afraid, or were you backing off? Or were you in fear of debating me in public like this? Right? And so Abu Hanifa replied with, what if I were to tell you that on my way to the place, I was stopped by a river, but there's no boat there. And so with the passing of time, suddenly there are woods, those piled up and created a boat. And so I boarded the boat. And so passing through the river. So basically he was explaining that if he were to tell that atheist that there was a boat that automatically assembled itself with the passing of time to arrive at that spot would you believe it? Right? And then that atheist or that philosopher basically say, how outrageous would it be? And so Abu Hanifa replied, that's exactly like your claim of a creator, of a creation without a creator, where everything automatically resembled or assembled themselves, right? And so another scientist, and so many scientists are actually in support of this view. Another scientist called Harold Bloom, he's an evolutionist, and he mentioned that the spontaneous function of the polypeptide of the size of the smallest known proteins seem beyond all probability. I'll explain a little bit. Polypeptide is basically the smallest unit on any possible proteins. And a simple example of it is basically DNA, which many of us knows that it would define our genetic makeup, right? And DNA in itself is made up of a lot of those polypeptides, right? So imagine DNA is our basic unit, and even more further basic than that is polypeptide, right? And this scientist, this evolutionist, Harold Bloom, mentioned about just the formation of this one single smallest unit is in itself beyond all probability. And William Stokes, again further on this, and he writes that amino acid to form proteins by chance, the probability is so small, and I quote, he says that it would not occur during billions of years on billions of planets, each covered by a blanket of concentrated watery solution of that necessary amino acid. So the basic form of a DNA, basically it's compiled of all amino acid, right? And he mentioned for all those amino acid in billions of planets, in billions of years, with all those resources, would not be able to explain that one single protein's existence. Right? And we further on, Fred Hoyle again, and his colleague, his colleague called Wehama Singh, right? He's, I believe, an Indian, and he did a maths model, right? We talk about probability, right? Now we will get into numbers finally, right? And you've been warned, it will be quite a big number for us to comprehend, but I'll try to make it more understandable. So he did a calculation, computer simulation basically, on a bacteria. So basically a bacteria, a single cell bacteria. So he calculated that what would be the probability of the most simple, basic enzyme or protein to be formed in that one cell. And so the result, and by the way, Fred Hoyle is a professor from Cambridge University. He himself is the professor, or his team basically has helped us explain the existence of different elements heavier than oxygen, or heavier than basically helium. Right, so he's very acknowledged in the science field, right, for his knowledge, for his contribution, right. And he mentioned, he did the maths and said the probability of a single protein to exist in that one single cell by probability would be 10 to the power of negative 20. Meaning that it's a 0.000 followed by 20 zeros and then 1. That's the probability of forming just one single protein within that cell, right? And there are over 2,000 of those proteins in that cell. right? And then he further on to do the maths. There are 2,000 of them, and each 10 to the power of negative 20. And a simple maths would arrive you with the probability to be 10 to the power of negative 40,000. I repeat, 10 to the power of negative 40,000. Meaning, it's 0 followed by 40,000 zeros probability. And why is this significant? Because science in itself, with the age of our universe and with the knowledge they know, science would generally define impossibility to be 10 to the power of negative 15. And yet, the probability of forming just one protein is already 10 to the power of negative 20. And there are over 2,000 of those. 10 to the power of negative 40,000. And so scientists generally don't argue against God. In fact, if those respectable scientists knows their ground, would stop at where science can explain, right? And so this, Fred Hoyle in his book, Evolution from Space, he writes, he says, this should be so obvious that if there was any reason, or if anyone would ever wonder why it's still not acceptable, so science would quote unquote use intelligence to explain a creator, basically. If all those are so obvious, then if there was any reason why people don't accept it, would be a psychological rather than scientific reason. And he's a scientist with no association to any religious belief. And he mentioned, with the odds against life so obvious to scientists, or those who know science, who truly know science, why is it still not accepted by majority? Is a psychological, but not a scientific problem, right? And so I'll continue with one of the laws that science would argue to be one of the most profound law, right? Einstein himself mentioned that there's this law in nature that is so profound that basically can explain a lot of our phenomena that hasn't been violated. It's called the second law of thermodynamics, right? And for you to understand or appreciate second law of dynamics, I can be telling you more about the first law first, right? What is the first law? First law is very simple, and I'm sure every one of us would have understand or appreciate it. So first law of thermodynamics mentioned that if there was an energy into a system, then that system would have an equivalent amount of that energy input. And if this system were to output the same amount of energy, then this system would have lost that amount of energy. Meaning, energy in would be the same energy out. And that's the first law of thermodynamics, right? Which makes perfect sense. Just as like our bank account, right? Whatever you put in, whatever you withdraw, the difference would be the remaining in your account, right? And so energy works the same, right? Just like our bank account, right? And so this is a law where it hasn't been violated, right? And so the second law of thermodynamics, for you to gain that better appreciation, second law of thermodynamics basically mentioned that for a closed system, there's a tendency for this system to go from orderly to less orderly. It's a trend that's happening throughout the entire universe. from orderly to less orderly, right? And so every phenomena we're experiencing should go through this trend. Or a simple analogy would be a guy's bedroom, right? So if you leave it as it is, with the passing of time in days or in weeks, that room will automatically become more messier or less orderly, right? And so science or nature in itself works the same way. So this is why our existence violates this very fundamental law of science. Right? And so all these are actually just pointing towards that if we were to actually talk about it or consider it from an intellectual perspective, science would be some of the strongest evidence humankind can ever come with to explain our existence. Right? And so, at the end of the day, as Fred Hoyle put it, it's a psychological, nafsani, but not aqlani problem, not intellectual problem. Right? And so I will end with mentioning a hadith that's collected in Sahih Jami', where Prophet Muhammad SAW mentioned that the most helpless of people are not the ones without strength, are not the ones without money, are not the ones who's weak, vulnerable, orphans in the society, but they are the ones who don't make dua, who doesn't call upon God. Right? And so guidance is something that in Islam, at least, Prophet Muhammad also mentioned guidance, if we ever sought it sincerely, we are guaranteed. Right? And so if we were to see all those calamities as nothing but a stepping stone or nothing more than a wake-up call for us believers and for non-believers, then it could be something that would change our life entirely. Right? And so I'll end with this, actually, how Muslims generally see calamities. There's a really problematic approach to it, right? Because it's the number one reason why people are losing faith in God, and especially amongst the Muslim youth. But how do we Muslims generally see calamities? Right? Prophet Muhammad was once approached by a companion. He asked Rasulullah, who amongst those who are most severely tested? And what was Prophet Muhammad's replied? The prophets. When you think about it, when the prophets are the most severely tested, what does that mean? Does that mean prophets would err? Does that mean prophets would make mistakes? But no. Those tests or those calamities are a means of their elevations. And the companion didn't stop there. He further asked, then who are the ones who's most severely tested next? Right? And Rasulullah mentioned, the ones whom Allah loved most. Right? And so it shows that calamities, sometimes we fail to recognize the blessing in it or to oversee the goodness in it, are actually a means of our elevation. Of course, at the end of the day, it depends very much on your choice. But all those are a means for us to get closer to Allah. Right? And so hardship or calamities can be generally classified into three types. It could be a punishment. But a punishment can be good if you recognize and turn back to Allah. Because subhanAllah, as human beings, some of the strongest lessons we learn are from the experience we have, from the mistakes we made, and from the choices we made. Right? And those choices or those lessons we learned makes us a better person. Then we would recognize the goodness in it afterwards. Right? So punishment in itself is not really a bad thing. Right? And so the second of all is a means of their forgiveness. Because remember, Allah is ultimately just. And justice not served in this world will most certainly served in the next. And so for believers, not even for a prick of a throne, will our sins be forgiven. And last but not the least, calamities are a means for our elevation. Are a means of our elevation. Because that one thing that is most rewarded without a limit, we know good deeds are multiplied by 10 times, by up till 700 times, right? But there's one thing that we will be rewarded without a limit, without a boundary, and that is bearing patience, sabr. Right? So if we bear patience in those calamities, we'll be elevated or rewarded in only a scale Allah knows. Right, so I conclude. So if there's any questions from the floor, please feel free.
Do you feel that nowadays people are not basing so much of their arguments on science anymore? It's more about them being distracted. Even if you say 2 years ago people were on the street talking about science. But when it comes to now, it goes to show that the youth and general public, they're more concerned, they're more distracted with entertainment and etc. etc. So when you run into a debate with them, it's become more easier to just make them believe there's a superpower out there. They won't discuss with you maybe, they'll leave it at that and they'll go. But they don't have any counter arguments. Do you feel like the trend is changing?
So
in today's time?
So basically the brother asks, is the trend, because in the past if you look into many on-streets debates on between religious groups and atheistic groups, most of them basically base their arguments on science. But now seems not to be the case, right? And I would say, as far as I've come across, I'm not sure for the West, but certainly people around me, for the non-Muslims I come across, majority of them has been agnostics, but not atheists. I would say there's still atheists here and there, but then agnostics are still the majority. Meaning, there are people who doesn't necessarily denounce the existence of God, nor do they affirm it. Right? So they live their life as it is without bothering themselves to search for a higher being. So I believe this has been the trend. This has been the majority of people. And it's because most of the more upfront atheists nowadays seem to fail, as just now I've quoted like Christopher Hitchens, he's one of them, very prominent proposition of atheism, right? And so he himself admits that all those fine tunings in science can't debate any theist on it, right? And so atheism or atheists have been approaching this arguments in a different perspective. So nowadays they have been arguing from a perspective on what our beliefs or what our faith call us into beliefs. Meaning some of the unseens. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend readers or audience to basically indulge into this field because some of the perspective they put out is very derailed and very negative, right? And so I believe they're going down this trend, but at the same time, nor can they explain or refute many of the arguments. Those are logical. Yeah. Any questions?
May I?
Yeah, please.
There's a very common trend when you're doing debate with atheists. basically, if you explain all these arguments to them, still they'll come to the notion, very common trap. Oh, we still don't know.
Exactly.
We still don't know. We don't know there's a creator. They say that the universe has been created, but we are not sure. We don't know. So is there any
Approach.
kind of approach? Yeah. How to handle this kind of that's like the end of the discussion,
Yeah.
basically. After you have explained the whole thing, they come to the conclusion, oh, sorry, we still don't know. Nobody's so sure.
Exactly. So basically, the brother asked. So after long discussions with probably those who affirms atheism, right? Usually they end the discussion with, "We can never be sure,
Yeah.
right? There could be a God, there could not be a God. But since it doesn't affect my life and how I would be living my life, why should I bother accepting him, right?" To be honest, this is a question I have a feeling would arise during the talk, right? And I've been thinking over it for the past couple of days, and I don't think I have the solution to it. Because for the past debates or discussions, I don't necessarily call it debates, or discussions I have with some of my peers who claims atheistic beliefs, would end the discussions like those. And I wasn't been able to come up with it. Because at the end of the day, I believe it's not an intellectual problem at the end of the day. If it's intellectual, we can be presenting, and if someone is open enough, subhanAllah, I remember I was in this open day, and there's this person I was talking with, and he claims to be an atheist, and he knows his science well. He knows his science. So there's a group of atheists who would be using science as a shield or as a sword to defend their atheistic belief. And he's the kind of guy who affirms the importance of science, but yet he's very eager in seeking guidance. And what I mean by that is, though he's a really strong science fanatics, I would say he's really like, when we talk about science, we click instantly. I'm the kind of guy who grew up watching National Geographics and all those documentaries, right? So I love science ever since young. And so when we talk about science, and we were so engaged, and when I talked to him about all those probabilities out there, all those how it violates the existence of how those physical laws violates our possible existence, right? He immediately accepts, and he further on even wanting to discuss further on it. And he's the kind of guy, though he's an atheist, but he's been attending churches, or he's been asking Pope. He's been asking Pope or those pastors about questions of faith, right? And when he asks questions, subhanAllah, it's not why Muslims pray 5 times a day. When he asks questions, those are in-depth questions. What I mean by those, he asks questions of evils, question of injustice that's happening in our world, right? He asks important questions about faith, right? So I believe, because at the end of the day, we can never judge anyone's sincerity, but they themselves, and they were ever sincere in seeking guidance, guidance would definitely come to them. Guidance would definitely come to them. So I wouldn't necessarily say that the ones we've been talking with who use this claim as a closing argument are necessarily unsincere, right? But I would see it as, could be their time is not there yet. And when people are faced with wake-up calls, it could be the time where they reflect upon the arguments or the discussions they have with Muslims, or how intellectually sound they put forth their arguments. and make them approach this religion first to explore the possible guidance it bring forth from it. So I would say I wouldn't necessarily see it as negative though, because as long as they have time, or as long as he's the kind of person who's open-minded, and I'm sure, because there's a hadith in Riyadus Salihin and actually collected in Sahih Muslim or Sahih Bukhari, that if a person, so it's a really long hadith that says there's no person who can draw closer to Allah through except the fard, through obligations and sunnah, right? And then the hadith continues, if a person walks to Allah, Allah will come running to them, and if a person comes an arm length arm length to it, Allah will come a span to him, right? Handstands to it, and arm stand to it, right? And this hadith shows that if a person is sincerely seeking Allah's guidance, he will definitely be guided. And we've heard of stories, revert stories, with the most instant change in their lives because of those people who accept Allah's wake-up calls. It could be their wake-up call isn't there, but I believe when it comes to discussion like this, we're basically planting seeds. And we shouldn't be expecting instant results. Because at the end of the day, guidance comes from, not from us, not from our discussion, but from Allah Himself, subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yeah.
I have a solution.
Yes, please.
And fear the fire and bear witness with the Muslim.
Though I would say fear is not necessarily a component that is negative, because punishment, sometimes it's the recognition of a punishment or a consequences of our choices makes us rethink of our choices, right? So I would say I purposely avoid the discussion on hellfire when it comes to my Muslim peers, but then it's a good point to note. Like, I mean, at the end of the day, it depends on the person you're talking
it
to.
depends on person to person.
Like, if it's a person who's stern, who's is hard, and if hellfire is a concept that would soften him, then I think it's an approach that we could possibly use, right? And again, I'm not affirming, but remember Rasulullah Sallallahu advised the companion to give the glad tidings first. When he was sent to Yemen, he was asked to give glad tidings, meaning the glad tidings of paradise. Right? And so this should still be our priorities when it comes to giving dawah, inshallah. Any more questions? Yeah, please.
The most common refutation by atheists is the use of the argument of the evil. If evil exists, there's no God. So how to counter?
So basically, the brother asked, some of the most common arguments that atheists would put forth is basically the argument of evil. If there is evil, then it's something that would be against God's majesty or out of His definition or His attributes, basically, right? And how I usually see evil, though, it's an evil to one side, but might not necessarily be an evil to another. I'll give you a beautiful analogy I've heard. Like when a mother brings her child to the hospital for an injection, right? The child, who thinks of his mother to be the most merciful person to him, would never ever so slightly think or thought of her mother would make him go through such pain. Think about it. Like if this child is mature enough, no, it's not. Like, no, it's not realistic. No, we see it like this. If a child thinks of his mother to be so merciful, then why would the mother have the child go through such excruciating pain of being injected? Right? And this perspective, if we were to change from the mother's perspective, it's a pain now, but it's for your own good. Right? So the question of evil is because sometimes we see something evil, it's not because something that's inherently evil, but because there must be some goodness in it that we fail to recognize. Right? And so all these comes especially in place when atheists sees whatever is happening in our world to be just limited to within this life. But yet our creed tells us that there is this hereafter that we need to look after. So if we were to balance this approach with the concept of hereafter, that the evil we see today, that the sufferings Muslims go through, is but an elevation or goodness for them in the hereafter, then ask yourself this: would you ever want to go through this suffering? Right? Because Rasulullah mentioned in a very profound hadith, where to the extent where, well, subhanAllah, when I first heard about this hadith, it gives me goosebumps. When Rasulullah mentioned that if a person on a day of judgment were to see the reward of the people of Bala, of the people of sufferings, of the poor people, they would want their skin sliced off to get the reward they're getting. They would want their skin sliced off because of seeing of all the rewards the people of poor, the people of oppressed, the people of people in need are getting. They will want their skin sliced off for that reward. Because to understand this life better, or to understand the concept of evil or sufferings better, you definitely need the concept of hereafter. Because it is one of the means to explain quote unquote evil we see. Those are actually in blessing in disguise. Yeah. Did I answer your question, bro? Yeah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
The one